Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My pleasure to welcome back to my show John Fox and Leor Margulies from Robbins Appleby, a law firm in downtown Toronto that these gentlemen co-head up the real estate legal group there. And they want to talk to me really desperately because last week, the Ford government introduced some new legislation on affordable housing. And some people think it's some of the most radical legislation, most forward-looking legislation in a long time. Other people say it doesn't go far enough. And it's going to be interesting to see if it passes, if it's changed. They've already had a couple of appeals from different local governments to change parts of it. So it's going to be interesting. But bottom line, what people think is that the Greater Toronto Area is going to have several million more people move here in the next 10 years. CMHC says we need 1.8 million additional homes if we're going to have any level of affordability. And so therefore, this legislation really attempts to ensure that we'll have affordable legislation. So I wonder if the two of you could give me just an overview description of the legislation for a second, and then we'll delve into a couple of detailed questions. So who wants to give me an overview of what's been provided?
John, you want to go ahead?
Sure. I had occasion to look, Brian, at some of the material that went around within the government related to it. And in the very back of it, there's a critical piece of information which I think defines this legislation. Housing starts over the last 10 years have been about 75,000 a year. So if you're going to generate 1.5 million new homes in the course of the next 10 years, you're going to have to double that. So this legislation, if you bring it all together, every single piece of it is aimed at making it easier to create housing from a developer's point of view. And I think that's really the linking component. The main objective here is to generate those additional housing starts and to make it as easy as possible to do that. And I'd say that's the connecting tissue.
A lot of the provisions of it almost seem to override municipal governments and or town councils and give more power to the mayors, strong mayor situations, and make it more difficult for town councils and or residents to oppose developments. It's almost as if the province doesn't think city councils have been doing their job. What do you think of
that? Well, if I can jump in, I mean, I think the problem is, and it all, if you go back to the housing affordability report that they did a year ago, all these, most of these, not all of them, but most of them come from that report that came out a year ago as to how are we going to find a way to build 1.5 million houses in 10 years. And a lot of it is in process, the development approval process, the zoning process, the appeal process to what's now called the Ontario Land Tribunal. And the government's looking at ways of basically cutting the red tape. It can take you 5 years to get a zoning through. It can take you for a property within a built-up area like Toronto. It can take you 10 to 15 years to rezone and get land from greenfield to shovels in the ground. In the 905, and you're going to never catch up with the growth that we're going to have in the GTA and the GHA unless you do something. So yes, they've taken away. What they've actually, with the mayor, the stronger mayor's approach is to allow mayors and to get through things that will take forever. We'll see how that works out. Yes, does it take away something from the council, from councillors? Perhaps there's a balancing act, and I don't think that, we're not going to talk about the strong mayors thing today, but it's part and parcel of streamlining the process, and things have to be done. And this legislation, we'll see it when as it rolls out and as the regulations roll out. But things like have as of right zoning in the high transit nodes, so that you don't have to go through 5 years of zoning. That it will be there. You're supposed to have it within a year, is what the legislation mandates. So that's it's big. Will it take away from the councils? It's going to take away actually from some of the residents. When we get into some of the changes of the zoning process and the appeal process, it still allows the cities to zone and to appeal, but the rights of individuals after it's gone through the zoning process will be removed or eliminated. So, but those are the large roadblocks in moving a development along. So yes, there's going to be some major changes, and you haven't heard from the other side, which is the municipal side. We had an election last week. Too busy to think about it. Go ahead, John.
Can I just jump in? Because I just want to answer your question with a very specific example taken directly from this draft legislation, which I think is now in second reading. So it's not really it might take away from city councils. It will take away from city councils. There's no sense in beating around the bush about that, right? So if you take a look at the way that deals with inclusionary zoning as compared to where the city of Toronto and the city of Mississauga were at in that, it pretty much dictates terms on three levels, which none of those cities would not have followed. So one, you're reducing the number of units dictated by the province. Two, you are reducing the length of time that inclusionary zoning units will be affordable from basically 99 years to 25, so a 75% chop in that. And three, where the city would have based a definition of affordability on income of the surrounding local area, so responsive to local needs, the province comes in and says your pricing is based on average market rent. That's not new. They didn't invent that. CMHC has been using that for years, but it is a big change, and it is certainly the province saying, I'm going to tell you guys what has to happen across Ontario, and there isn't room for local changes because we're going to legislate that. So there's definitely taking away. And it is a real change in how inclusionary zoning would work. And that's an example directly from the legislation, to your point, Brian.
And John, this change in the amount is quite significant, is it not? It's down to 5% from something that's going to go up to 20% over the course of the next couple of years in the original plan that the City of Toronto had.
Yeah, it's a gutting of that original scope of authority that a municipality would have had to do inclusionary zoning. There are countervailing pieces in this legislation, though. So, for example, you can get some of the things that you would have gotten out of affordability through DC exemptions, which would be available for private developers who are hitting affordability measures. So it could be that we will see some of the drop in affordable units under inclusionary zoning made up for voluntarily, particularly where you'd be selling at a price that is close to 80% of the average market. I
happen to think that's a really major change and a really positive one. And so we're going to come back and talk about that one in a little bit more detail after the break, because it really is an elimination of development costs. And so I think that's a fairly significant one, and it's across the board if you reach that affordability threshold. Anyway, we're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just a few minutes. But I do think that John's comment is interesting. This legislation was announced Tuesday after the Monday election. And so they waited until after we've all voted for our city councils to announce a bunch of legislation that effectively has the province overriding a lot of the powers that city councils across the province have. I think it's because effectively the province is saying, city councils, you're not doing the job. You're not doing the job to create the housing. And they didn't want to say that during the election, but they're certainly willing to say it the day after the election. We're going to take a break. We'll be back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. The topic tonight is the new province of Ontario's affordable housing legislation that's just been tabled. It's not been passed as of yet, but it tries to dramatically change the level of building in the marketplace, and also to provide more affordable housing. And I think one of the big issues that has been prevalent in the real estate business, in the housing business, in the development business is affordability based on just lack of supply, given the demand, or is it based on developers not willing to build cheap enough, affordable, and rent them out, affordable homes? And this legislation really, to me, John, seems to be looking at increasing supply in a lot of different ways. We were just chatting a little bit about these development charges, and I think what you're referring to is that for affordable homes, development charges have been eliminated. And, you and I talked, I don't remember when it was, I think a year ago, when inclusionary zoning was proposed by the city of Toronto. And actually, I think it was Lior at the time who said that in 13 different cities around North America, only twice had inclusionary zoning been put in place without incentives to the developers. Right. Here, what you're doing is not just inclusionary zoning in transit areas, but affordable housing right across the city. You're eliminating development charges. And I know that you gentlemen have complained that development charges are high and that the city of Toronto last year increased them dramatically. So this sounds like it's a fairly big change, is it not, John?
This is a big change on a couple of fronts. First of all, if you think about the policy that is underlying this as delivering a lot of supply, trying to generate a lot of just general supply, there are a couple of ways where they are trying to influence the pricing of that supply, which is important because housing has been a crisis if you couldn't afford it for decades. It's not a recent phenomenon for a lot of people. So two of those methods are all nonprofit development is now DC exempt. So if a nonprofit is building, it's just exempt. And also, if you're a private developer, then if you are delivering units at 80% of the average resale price, if you're selling condos, then that unit is also exempt. So there will be an encouragement in that to developer to keep costs in a place where they are low relative to the average market. Now, one of the things that's interesting there is if they adopt the same catchment area as CMHC, which would be the city of Toronto, you would hit 80% of average resale at the actual local market in many parts of the city. And so one of the implications of this is that you could have very few development charges once you're outside the city and develops outside the center of the city. And one of the question marks raised by municipalities is we still have to pay for the infrastructure. So where does that come from? So there is a balancing going on here between that encouragement for lower pricing and who has to pay for actual development costs which come along, which you can't get out of. I mean, you still have to people still want to have showers, even if it's in a new building. So you have to build that infrastructure.
Yeah, but tell me about the rationale here. So, we talked about this when you have inclusionary zoning or affordable housing, what you're doing is you're providing a social good, and I think society wants to provide those cheaper housing alternatives to society at large. But when development charges were there or you didn't have any incentive for inclusionary zoning, effectively that cost was being borne by everybody else that was buying a new home. And so the question is, does the cost of more affordable housing, should it be borne by the buyers of new homes in the same apartment building or the same area, or should it be borne by society in general?
Well, I mean, generally, redistribution of wealth should be borne by society in general, if that's what you're asking. There's a lot of policy that goes around that. We have generally had development pay for development in the past and have used development charge waivers and deferrals for the past 20 years as means of supporting the creation of affordable units. The reason we do that is because there's a variety of people at a variety of income levels. The 80% level, in your imagination, you should be thinking about people who work in our law firm. You should be thinking about nurses and teachers. That's who you're really housing in that kind of environment. And then there's a whole other level of supportive housing and low-income housing, which follows on, which is today almost entirely supported by the public purse.
Okay, so I see this as a very positive move because it's that development charge, that development cost, that infrastructure cost, because it's not going to be funded by development charges, which are borne by new home buyers. It's going to be borne by society at large. That's smart. It's social housing is going to be built by everyone. But you're right, municipalities are going to be losing some money, some tax revenue, and so therefore they got to get the money from somewhere else.
Exactly. So we are left with the question: if there is a gap, is that coming off the property tax base through the municipality, or is that going to ultimately be at a federal or a provincial level and have it based on an income tax base?
Well, they've also suggested. But I think Ford suggested, or Mr. Clark suggested, that the shortfall in those development charges that are going to be waived or reduced, because there's also some capping. There's a whole other scheme for general DCs for new DC bylaws that when you come up with your increase, you have to phase it in over 5 years. So there's going to be a loss of revenue there for infrastructure. And I think Clark suggested that it come from the Federal Infrastructure Fund. There's a $1.6 billion fund, I think. And he says, well, you should be getting it from there. Well, that sounds good. But if you don't, where's it going to come from? That's the big $1 million question.
He's also pointed development charge reserves to Lior and other places within municipalities.
That's right. Yeah, they're sitting on billions of dollars that they have for development charge. They haven't spent them because they don't have the infrastructure projects in place. Although when you drive around the city, it seems like everything is under infrastructure war here. Every street is torn up. But notwithstanding that, they have money, but the city says, well, that's money that we need, that we've earmarked for the future. You can't rob Peter to pay Paul. That's their point about, well, we're not going to use our reserves. But of course, that's
Lior, stepping back, we've had this crisis of lack of supply, supposedly. We need to do something to increase supply and improve the general level of affordability. Last year, and I think you were the one that, sometime last year complained about it. The City of Toronto increased development charges by 47%. And what you've got here is the province coming down and saying, no, cities, this is wrong. You can't be increasing development charges like crazy, particularly in an environment when we have a lack of affordability and a lack of supply. And I think this really is the province telling the cities what to do. It's interesting. John, there was also a change with rental replacement, which I think is interesting. Tell us about that if you could.
It's similar. So let me just make sure everybody listening understands what we're talking about here. So if you picture a strip mall in Toronto that comes into redevelopment, very classic with storefronts on the first floor and apartments on the second, you might have 10 or 12 units. The rental replacement bylaw would say if you knock that down, you've got to replace those rental units within the building that you build at roughly the same rental rate. And there is some complexity there in terms of the ownership, which drives developers a bit bananas. So the notion there would be, I think that the province is looking at curtailing that or eliminating it. It is considered by the development industry to be a bit of a drag on a pro forma, because you've got to, instead of just doing condo and selling them, you've now got to either operate or sell rental units. There is a fairly vigorous debate as to whether you can recover on that and what the real drag is. So from my perspective, though, eliminating that is part of a missing second plank of this kind of policy. I think supply is great, but maintaining supply of existing stock is also important at different levels, and that was a good policy for doing that. So there's only two cities in the province where that is in play, which is Mississauga and the City of Toronto. So we will certainly see some reaction from those municipalities in this regard. By and large, the developers I have who buy those sites, it is now an understood phenomenon, is baked in the cake, and they carry on and develop it nonetheless. So I was a little surprised to see it, to be honest, and expect that they will get some feedback from the housing advocates about the elimination of that policy.
But John and Brian, it's unclear what they're going to do with that rental replacement policy. They said that they've given the minister the power to pass regulations to deal with how it's to be operated, because there are flaws in the whole process. And I suspect they won't eliminate it completely, because it recognizes, particularly in the City of Toronto, that you just can't replace units at current market levels by if you just eliminate them and put up condos at twice the rent, you are going to affect affordability. But there are some real development stumbling blocks in the process, and I'm expecting that he will tweak it and not eliminate it. I think it would be that will cause a social outroar, but it's possible. It certainly will make development better, faster and cheaper. But it will eliminate, the dwindling supply. So that remains to be seen how he's going to use the power and what the power will be. They haven't really specified it yet.
But it's kind of interesting. You explained, John, that some of the municipalities might be disappointed that they lose some of that lower priced rental stock, which makes sense. But if I was a developer coming to buy a site, and there was the strip mall that you example you talked about, and it had 10 or 20 units that were currently being rented, and I had to replace them in the new building at similar rates. What that does is creates a huge disincentive for me to buy the piece of property and develop a new building, because it's going to be a drag on the economics of that new building. And so therefore, there's got to be at the margin some buildings that don't get built because of that. There's got to be some. And so therefore, I think what this is driving at, is it not, is affordability can be more impacted by increasing total supply rather than necessarily picking and choosing and forcing people to keep cheap supply around. Because when you force people to keep some cheap supply around, what that does is restricts the creation of substantially new supply.
Right. So I completely agree with what you said, other than the conclusion there, Brian. So I agree with you that there will be marginal sites that won't get developed because somebody is going to say, I don't want this, or that the land price will be adjusted to reflect it, which is largely what has happened. Unlike inclusionary zoning, this has been around a long time. And so this is just part and parcel of land pricing in Toronto. So I don't know how many of those marginal sites there would be. But while I'm all in favor of additional supply, the maintenance of a variety of levels of rent is really important. And if we don't actually intervene in that, we end up forcing increasingly concentric rings of low-income housing further and further outside the city, which is not a healthy result. So you're exactly on point here, because you're getting at where should a government intervene and where should it not? And governments are there to intervene for this, right? Sometimes there is red tape for a reason. And this is an example of a place where I personally think, this is a political choice on my part, obviously, that this is an example of where there is some red tape. It is there for a reason. I agree with what Lior said too, though. There are parts of this which I wish they would scrap. Like you cannot hold those replacement units in condo form, which creates an unnecessary administrative task for both lawyers and developers, which is not necessary to fulfill the goal that I'm talking about. So I think that they should be proceeding with trepidation, not just because there'll be an outcry, but because I think it's the right thing to do to leave some form of rental replacement in place.
Bottom line, they're trying to increase density fairly dramatically in the city of Toronto, and in the suburbs around the city of Toronto. Do you think they achieve that?
I think that if there's a host of processes that they're trying to eliminate or tweak, I think it will move if they can get them through, and there's a lot here to do. I think it will, because if you can develop faster, then we can build faster. Now, no one's taught what this legislation can deal with is the fact that there's only so much materials and so much labor supply we have, and we're running near capacity, or we were up to about a few months ago. So somehow they're going to have to address, even if they could sell more and create more units that have been zoned, how are they going to build them with the current labor and supply restrictions? That's an answer that's not dealt with in this legislation. So that's what they're going to bump up against. But this legislation, there's so many good things in there that they cut out so much what I consider, excuse my French, bullshit. The heritage stuff, the conservation authorities, the appeals at the OLT. This amount of streamlining, you may say, for instance, I'll just give you one, and
let's come back to that, because I want to go through those in detail. Let's come back to those after the break, Lior, if I could. Okay. But bottom line, you think that this will increase density in the Greater Toronto Area
if it's implemented? Yeah, I think it can. It may not get us 1.5 million homes over the next 10 years, but it will create more homes than without it, so significantly and faster, definitely.
Lior has referenced that there's changes to the Ontario Land Tribunal, to limitation on Conservation Area Authority rights. There's a whole raft of changes that limit different organizations' ability to object to development proposals. We're going to take a break and come back, and we're going to ask Lior to take us through some of those changes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. The topic tonight is really development of affordable housing in the Greater Toronto Area, and increasing the supply of housing in the Greater Toronto Area. And if you've been listening to my show at all over the course of the last little while, you'll know that I am firmly of the belief that that city governments across Southern Ontario have been limiting supply through red tape, through development charges, through a bunch of regulation, giving into local neighborhood NIMBYism, et cetera, that has really damaged the supply of housing. And I think that's one of the major costs of our current system. And the provincial government on Tuesday last week came in with some dramatic changes that effectively take a lot of power out of local city councils and of a lot of other organizations in their ability to regulate, to slow down, to have influence on development, making development easier. And I think that's positive for the development business. But I also think it's going to be development for all of us, because, or at least, the generation that don't own homes, because it's going to be easier to buy a home because there's going to be more there. At least that's the hope. And some of those changes are really kind of interesting. And I thought, Leo, it would be helpful to go through them if we could. So there's been many changes to the Ontario Land Tribunal and how that works. Leo, can you explain what the Ontario Land Tribunal is and what some of the changes are?
Sure. Well, for those of you who don't know it, because it's changed its name so many times, even I forget about it. It's in its predecessor form, it was called the Ontario Municipal Board. And for some reason, the Liberal government decided it needed another name, the Local Planning Authority Tribunal, and now it's called the Ontario Land Tribunal. And it's had an up and down history in terms of what it can do, but it's a very unique organization. I suspect that there is virtually no other comparable tribunal in North America or possibly the world where there is a process to appeal a city's zoning decision. I'm not aware of one. We have it here in Ontario, where if you're not happy with what the city has said on your zoning and other planning approvals, you can appeal it to a tribunal that will assess it from a planning perspective. It's a great counterbalance to municipal power. So it's been great, but it's also been used to delay projects unnecessarily. Municipalities use that feature to say, well, you know what, or particular local councillors will say, well, you know what, I'd love to get this development through, but my ratepayers will never elect me again if I allow the 60-story building to go. So you know what, you go to the, and as you know, local councillors carry a lot of weight at council. So we're not going to let it through. You go to the OLT and you'll get your order there, and then I'm fine. I can say, hey, ratepayers, I didn't do it, the OLT did it. And so that adds a lot of time to the whole process. And then what you get is also, even where the city's on side, ratepayers have a right to complain and make representations to the city. But they can also go and appeal it. One guy for, I don't know, $400 can file an appeal on a 400 unit project and tie it up for years. Yes, there's a process to get rid of frivolous appeals. It's very rarely used, and you end up with appeals that drag on, that are unnecessary. So what they've done is they said, okay, we want to use this for this appeal tribunal for the right people and for the right results. So one thing that is exceptionally dramatic is they're eliminating the right to appeal a zoning decision by anyone other than basically a municipality or certain government bodies. So yes, you were a ratepayer organization and you fought with the city, you fought with the developer, you negotiated. This is what the city ordered or didn't order. The developer takes it to OLT. The city is still there at the table, and they're the ones who should be at the table. But the ratepayers will not be there. You will not get the individual a person or a group appealing. Now that you can argue is good or bad because it limits the democratic rights, but that's a major change. That's a huge change. They're going to increase their powers to dismiss appeals for frivolous appeals, and effectively October 25th, if you had an appeal and you didn't have a hearing date set, and you're an individual or you're not a city essentially, your appeal is going to be dismissed. So this is huge. This is going to streamline the process and limit the appeals to the cities and developers where it should be. It's the city who should be managing the process, not having individuals or even a local ratepayer dealing with it, because it's a city decision. It's not just a local decision. So that's the viewpoint certainly of the development industry. I'm sure there are ratepayers that will be outraged that they will no longer be able to go to the OLT. I can tell you that.
Conservation Authority. There's a
Correct.
significant limitation on Conservation Authority rights. Tell us about
Well,
that.
I mean, the problem is right now when you're developing in an area that the Conservation Authority has input, which is it can be within the city and it can certainly be in Greenfield. Their ability to comment on a proposal for subdivision or rezoning is almost unlimited. There's no real controls. You can't appeal to the OMB or the OLT, their decision. And if you talk to any developer, you can say that they're one of the biggest stumbling blocks in terms of time. You can spend years dealing with them, and they keep coming back with comments, whether they're really conservation related or not, and there's no way to get to the end. So one of the things that these legislation comes up with is that they're going to limit what they can comment on, and I'm sure have a process that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. They haven't spelled it out, but I know this has been a huge issue. You don't hear about it, but you talk to any developer, they pull their hair out when it comes to Conservation Authority. So limiting their ability to slow down a development process will be huge.
I noticed that the region of Halton conservation area and all the mayors in the region of Halton have already objected to the province on exactly this topic.
Right. Oh, it's going to start. This is there's so much you can object to from a municipal thing. And there's two sides to every story. So, but this conservation thing is big and that will help move certainly Greenfield stuff much faster.
I was surprised by this removal of an upper tier approval power for the region of York, the region of Durham. So it's some regions, but it's not all regions.
No, it's all regions. No, it's all second tier, upper tier municipalities. Toronto, there is no upper tier. We used to have the municipality, metropolitan Toronto, and the 5 cities. Now it's all one. But in most other outside of Toronto, for the most part, you've got the region of Durham, region of Peel, region of York, and you have to go through 2 levels of zoning for any type of condominium or subdivision approval. I'm going through now one in Cambridge. So you have Cambridge, and then you have Waterloo, region of Waterloo, and it's a double process. And I'm just seeing a very small microcosm of it. Everybody has their own inputs, and you have to go through 2 of them to get to the end. This doesn't mean that the region won't have input on any of these rezonings or not the rezoning, but the subdivision and condominium, but they won't control it. It will be at the municipal level, which is where it should be. It should be the city. So it eliminates or reduces another layer of red tape. That's
reduction of site plan control for developments of 10 units and under.
Yeah,
What's
this
that
is
about?
great. Well, right now, if you're developing, if I take two lots here and I knock down the houses and I want to put up 4 townhouses, I need to go through site plan control. That's a whole process with the city in terms of landscaping and exterior work, and it's a whole layer of red tape. And they're saying for small developments, as long as you meet building code and zoning, take it out of the site plan process, which will add another 6 months to a year to development. So now we can do smaller developments without that other headache. It's a nice little feature. We're overloaded in the city of Toronto. They don't have enough planners. So get rid of the small stuff and let them focus on the big stuff. It's logical. And
then there's another one on the reduction of parkland development charges. Tell us about this parkland.
That's involved. It's a more involved process, but that's a big cost. Just like DCs are big cost, parklands are a huge cost, and the formulas are going to be capped. Because before you were, it was they basically reduced by 50% the amount of parkland that you may have to give and cap the valuation. I don't want to go into the details.
No, but the detail is kind of interesting, Lior, because one of the things that developers found is that they didn't know what their economics were, because the amount of money that they would have to give in parkland dedication could change between the time they initiated a proposal and the time the proposal actually came to fruition. What this does is it sort of anchors in time at the beginning of the process the amount of money you got to give, the amount of parkland dedication. So I think what it does is it even if it's not reduced, and I think what you're saying is it's reduced as well, but it gives knowledge, it gives firm knowledge, certainty to the developer that, okay, this is how much parkland I'm going to have. And I've heard stories of some cities that have been increasing their parkland dedication amounts dramatically over the course of the last couple of years.
True, and you're right. There is this uncertainty. So one of the things they did is they froze the rate of whatever you have to contribute at the time you apply for your zoning or site plan. So at that point in time, you don't come 2 years later and suddenly they've changed the rules of the game. They've capped the valuation at 10% of the land value. Whereas before it was based on the municipality could do it two ways, based on units per hectare, and you ended up at times of an amount of a parkland equal to or greater than DC's in the 905s. Toronto has been pretty good till recently, but they've been talking about lifting their caps, and it's just another huge charge. So freezing it at the beginning and then capping the amounts of their certainty at a fair rate is going to help the cost, and that's what we're talking about: bringing down cost or time. Those are the two things that this legislation does: save time, and that's equal to money, or save the actual cost, like parkland and DCs. Definitely.
John, one of the other big changes here was an attempt to address this issue that we talked about at one point in time in the past about the missing middle. Can you tell me what they're doing there?
Well, what they're trying to do is increase density of housing within established neighborhoods. So in a neighborhood not unlike my own, Brian, where we are close to a subway but have mostly single family residential, they're trying to indicate that the municipality should not be able to stop you from converting your home into multiple units. They did not go as far as the task force recommendation in this case, sticking pretty much with what the City of Toronto allows you to do now. And I don't think they're banking on this as a big component of their strategy. They, in their documents, say that they expect maybe 5,000 units a year. So against the 150,000 they're needing, they're not really expecting a massive change within the what they call the yellow belt, which is a single family residential. I do think that there's a lot of potential for increased density. You asked Lior about this earlier, particularly around transit stations and along avenues, where being able to put up a development which is less than 10 units, for example, without site plan control is now a real possibility. I think those are places where there are big gains to be made. There should not be just a big parking lot beside a subway station anymore, ever. And this act will help drive density in those pockets for sure. But the missing middle itself, I don't think they're counting on a lot out of it either.
So lots of changes to increase supply, and I think that Build and CMHC and lots of different organizations that represent the development industry have been calling for legislation like this. And Lior mentioned this affordability task force that came out with I think it was 55 different recommendations in the spring of this year, recommended a bunch of changes. But then the other day, front page of the newspaper, or maybe there was the business section, condos are being put on hold because of interest rate increases and softness in pricing. Condominium development that was moving at an incredible pace in the last couple of years has been put on hold. And Lior, I actually spoke with someone the other day who said that they were having lunch with an excavation company. And the excavation company was desperate for business. And he said, when the excavation company is desperate for business, 6 months from now, the problem that you identified about construction workers and things like that, the whole business is going to be desperate for business. So what that says to me is, whoa, maybe the whole construction development business is putting the brakes on because of the market. And so is this too little too late?
No, I don't think so. I mean, right now you have sort of the perfect storm of a bubble market, increases of 30 to 50% over 2 years. The impacts of COVID on the supply chain, which have ratcheted supply, labor, and material costs up. And now you have, because you have runaway inflation, in part related to those increased costs, you have the government saying we got to bring back inflation down to 2%, raising interest rates. So that's adding extra cost to the financing of the developer, and it's making the units unattainable to purchasers because they can no longer qualify because interest rates are going up. So that's what's, and you have uncertainty in the marketplace. So investors are starting to sort of pull back and saying, let's see where things land before I jump in at 14 or 15 or 1,800 a square foot. I'm going to take a breather. Now, that's not to say that they haven't sold. There are projects that are selling, but there's no question there's a slowdown, and it had to come. I mean, it just doesn't keep going on forever, but that's temporary. The immigration is going to continue. The need for housing is going to continue. The problem is the affordability right now. You can't afford it. So is this too little, too late? No. This is laying the groundwork for when the market stabilizes, interest rates come down a bit, costs come down, which, as you say, they are going to come down because there's going to be more supply and it will be less demand. So no, I don't think it's too little, too late. I think the problem will be in a few years if this does come through and we have even more projects that are available to be built. How are we going to build them? Because I think we still will have the issue. Right now, you don't have you may not for the next 6-8 months. Yes, you may be able to get trades that you could never get or at rates that you can afford, but that's only temporary. Don't be fooled by that headline in the Star. I read that headline as well too. It's true, but it has to happen. It's good. You know what? I hate to say it, and my clients will shoot me, but it's good. You need that sort of adjustment in the marketplace. It'll flesh out the marginal projects, and it will hopefully allow people to retool and for us to actually get these groundwork, these groundbreaking changes in place, so that when the market comes back, we can start. We still have to approve projects. Projects are still going to get approved. They're just not going to get launched, or developers have put them on hold because they don't think the market is there right now. But in 6-8 months from now, when rates start coming down and the supply costs are not making it reasonable, they're going to be launching, and people are going to be buying because they got to live somewhere. That's the reality. Housing and food, you don't have a choice. You got to eat and you got to live somewhere.
Well, ironically, just this past couple of days, the federal government has announced increasing the immigration targets from 400 and something thousand to 500,000 people a year. So you're right. Immigration is going to continue to happen. The countervailing force that you're probably aware of is, for the first year in history last year, there was in recent history, there was out-migration from the province of Ontario. People actually, probably because of housing prices and maybe some other issues as well, the province of Ontario lost people. So people were voting with their feet and their wallets to move out of Ontario, which is, I thought, a astounding thing. We're going to take a final break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with Leora Margulies and John Fox from Robbins Appleby, and try to sum this all up and see whether we think Toronto is going to be better in the future or not, given this legislation. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. Our topic tonight is real estate, affordable housing, new legislation that the Ontario government has proposed that will, they think, dramatically increase the amount of home building, condo building, apartment building, increase housing, and make it more affordable in the city of Toronto and in the suburbs around the city of Toronto, the Greater Toronto Area, Southern Ontario, etc. John Fox and Leora Margulies, partners in the real estate group at Robbins Appleby, have joined me and have walked us through the legislation and what it is and what it changes. But now let's turn and ask you lawyers for your opinions, which is something that I love doing with lawyers, not just the facts and help me win the case, but what you think about it. John, what do you think about this legislation? Is it good or bad?
Well, on balance, I think it's good. Like you've heard me in the course of this call quibble with some of the balancing in it, and I would love to quibble about that with the minister, but I have a lot of respect for what he's done here. You asked Leora whether it was too little, too late. I don't think it is. I think he can only do what he can do, and he's doing just about everything he can do in this legislation. And I don't think it is all just in line with classic conservative methodology. That dramatic change where you're limiting appeals to the OLT was used across the board. That's not That's not just lefties he's picking on. That's the very guys who are saying, I don't want this development because I want my neighborhood to stay the same. And that has been a traditional conservative voting bloc. So I think he is willing to move forward and take some heat from all sides. I have a lot of respect for that. I hope he listens to what people have to say, because I think there are some improvements that can be made. But in general, I think it's a positive piece of legislation. I think it's positive to be having this kind of conversation. And I think in the end, I'm an optimist. I always think Toronto is going to be better off in the future because I have a ton of faith in the people of Toronto. But I think this will be helpful legislation at the end of the day.
Lior, what do you think?
Well, I mean, we've had, before the Conservatives came in, we had 12 years of liberal legislation that ground down the development industry, that added costs, regulations, and this is undoing, number one, undoing all the harm they did, but it's blowing up the system. We recognize that we have a massive problem here in the country and in this GTA area. And if you don't do something massive, we're just going to continue along. And a lot of the problem is at the municipal level. So the province is taking a gutsy move to say, we're going to blow it up in some respects. We're going to move things forward. We're going to make the mayor stronger so we can have someone making decisions instead of quibbling for days and weeks and months. So I think the legislation is great. I think it's going to be challenging. You're going to get a lot of pushback, and there may be some adjustments to it. But I think if we can get it through, it will allow municipalities with the right leaders to do the right things, and it will eliminate or reduce the NIMBYism that we have. We can't, Toronto has 70% of Toronto is all single family neighborhoods. It's great, but you'll never grow that way. So there's got to be a balancing. So I think it's fantastic to see somebody taking a chance and saying, we've got to do something dramatically different to make this work. And that's what this legislation does. Governments generally don't do that. But I think this government, it feels comfortable enough. It's in its second term, and there'll be unhappy people, but I think people want housing. They recognize that, and they have to do something. And just adding IZ isn't going to add more affordable housing to 90% of the population. So they dealt with it. So I think this legislation is excellent. The proof will be as they roll it out. There's a lot of detail that has to come. It's going to take really a couple of years for it to fully roll out. But some of the stuff, the OLT stuff, is immediate, and that will push through some developments faster, and more developments that will be more product, and more product will ultimately reduce the price.
So I'll give you my 2 cents. I think this is a very good legislation, because I do think that we've had a crisis of supply in the last couple of years. I think that there's some of the run-up, according to CMHC. I interviewed the deputy economist of CMHC, who said he thought 15 to 20% of the run-up in pricing in housing in the Toronto area was due to low interest rates. I was surprised by that, because I think the vast majority of people think all of the run-up in housing prices is due to low interest rates. He said, no, it's only 15 to 20%. He says the vast majority of it is because of lack of supply. And that the regulatory hurdles one has to go through, and the time frame that it takes in Toronto is the longest in North America. And when in my own personal experience, I think that's the truth. And I think a lot of it is local councillors. I interviewed Joe Barrage, Urban Strategies, who said that because of the OLT, OMB, whatever you want to call it, the different tribunals, he said councillors don't have to grow up and act like adults. They can act like kids, because they know that someone over their head is going to actually approve it. I've recently done a job in Dallas, and it was interesting that the Dallas Council doesn't have a tribunal on top of them. So if they want to have housing, they've got to actually make the decision. They've got to decide if this is the housing they want. They don't have someone that they can blame for approving it. So I think there's some truth in that. And I think what this legislation really does is it takes some of the power that local councillors have that was negative, and local regulatory bodies with Conservation Air Authority that you mentioned, et cetera, and disciplines them and tells them, no, the overriding objective we've got to have is for more affordable housing, and hopefully with greater supply, it's going to be affordable. And I do think that is one change that, versus the City of Toronto. The City of Toronto, with inclusionary zoning last year, really tried to get at affordability by having a certain segment of the housing that was lower cost, inclusionary zoning. What this housing bill is all about, I think, is the general level of affordability by increasing supply. And increasing supply through all the different means that you talked about, speeding up the process, increasing density, taking away development charges, making more certain the parkland charges, not allowing as many appeals to the OLT, not allowing conservation authorities to get so involved in the muck of proposals. I think this is really positive, and I think that still only good stuff is going to get approved. It's just going to get approved more quickly with less charges and less red tape. So I think that's pretty good.
Right. Absolutely.
Well, John Fox and Leor Margulies, the leaders of the real estate practice at Appleby Robin law firm in downtown Toronto, really thank you very much for walking us through this legislation. And I hope that all of our positivity is right. It gets passed, it gets implemented, and developers build a bunch more housing.
Thanks for having us, Brian.
Thank you very
much. That's
our
show
Brian.
for today, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts are available wherever podcasts are available, and my videos are similarly available on my website, briancrombie.com, YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, etc. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Good night.